All right, well, I'm going to get started. The last stragglers will have to catch up with us as we go along here. My name is Glenn Keeler. I am the president of the board of the Canadian University Survey Consortium, and we are thrilled to be able to present once again the results of our survey. As I mentioned before, we have a lot of folks who have registered for this, and 44 different institutions are represented amongst all the registrants. And some of you may not be familiar with the consortium or its history or what we're about. So let me take a moment and tell you that we go back quite a ways. In fact, 2024 will be our 30th year of operations. So it goes back a long ways. Way back in 1994, we started with a grand total of 8 institutions participating, and as of the highest in that we had one a couple of years ago, we had 44 institutions participating. And we want to emphasize that we are a national institution where the participating institutions come from across Canada. There's the little map. This is the institution since 2014. In 2014, we restructured our surveys so that they fall into the current cycle, where in the first year, we do a first year student survey. Then the subsequent year, we'll do a middle year student survey, and that's the one we'll be looking at today. And then in the year after that, we do a graduating student survey so that we can address the different issues that are raised with each of those groupings of students. There are common questions on each of the surveys, but each of them also addresses things that are unique. First year students, you're talking a lot about transition to university. How are you managing that? And then with the graduating students, there's a number of questions that are about transitioning out of university. How are you preparing to carry on with study? How are you preparing to move into the workforce? Those sorts of questions. So we think, but we're maybe biased, that this is the best national source of undergraduate university student information in the country. And so we are very pleased to be able to present results from that. Prairie Research Associates has been our partner in this project for a very long time, and Nicholas Borodenko in particular has been our key person there. And so I'm going to turn things over to Nicholas in a second. Just a couple of issues on how we're running the meeting. We're going to keep all of you muted and cameras off. This is way too many people to manage all of that by voice, but please do put questions that occur to you into the meeting chat. And if it's something I can address quickly, I'll answer it in the meeting chat. We'll save ones that Nicholas needs to address to the end and have him address those at the end of his presentation. So if you could use the meeting chat to pose your questions, we'll try and take care of things there. All right, Nicholas, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you carry on from this point.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Glenn. I'm just going to get the presentation up and running here. Perfect. Good. So this is a presentation on the results from the 2023 middle year student survey. And so this presentation looks at the aggregate level results from the survey for 2023 for the 29 participating universities who participated in what is now the 29th cooperative study undertaken by CUSC. So the survey for those 29 participating universities was sent out to almost 54,000 students with just over 11,000, close to 12, who responded and completed the survey with an overall response rate of 21.5%. The response rate is down considerably from 2020 when it was at 29%. Response rates in surveys in general in the post-secondary sector for a number of different reasons, a bunch which I could present about COVID later on, have been dropping, but there have been ways that we have been working with CUSC to try to make sure those response rates maintain or increase as best as possible. In terms of the results we see today, the results were weighted back to the size of the student population. So not every university samples a census of their middle year students. So data represented here today is weighted back to the student populations of each of those universities. So let's take a look through the results of the 2023 survey, starting with a profile of our middle year students. And so about 7% of middle year students say they have children. 39% self-identify as being a member of visible minority group, and 85% identify as citizens. In terms of a gender breakdown, and this gender breakdown is provided by institutions as part of their sample file. It's about 2/3 identified as females to about 1/3 males. There is about a little less than 1% who identify as another gender category. This is pretty in line. This doesn't overrepresent females. It's about in line with what the samples that are provided by. So although it's about 2-to-1 female to male, that is about what we receive in the sample files from institutions. The average age of middle year students about 23 years of age, which, when you couple that with about 7% having children, sort of goes hand in hand. About 6% of students self-identify as being Canadian Indigenous. And in terms of their marital status, 68% of those are single. So we asked questions about disabilities or impairments. 40% of students say they have a disability or impairment. This is up fairly considerably from 2020, when it was 30% who identified as having a disability or impairment. Overall, the most common issue identified is a mental health issue. Around a quarter of students say they have a mental health issue. Other common disabilities or impairments, neurodivergence at 15%, learning memory at 7%, other types of chronic conditions at 5%, and vision at 4%. When we look at those, we ask students if they have a disability or impairment and how often it impacts them. So overall, about 15% say their issue impacts them daily, with about 8% of those being those with mental health. We also find that female students are more likely than male students to self-identify as having a disability or impairment. 46 of female students identify as having a disability or impairment, compared to 26% of male students. So looking at living arrangements in terms of how middle year students are currently living, the most common way they're living is they're living with family. So this could be parents, this could be cousins, aunts, uncles. They're living with some type of family member. If you combine, you get a little bit more who are renting, either in off-campus or an on-campus housing. And then you've got 7% of those who say they have a home. Amongst those who are not currently living on campus, if asked if they would live on campus, visible minority students, so those who self-identify as visible minority, are more than twice as likely to say they would prefer to live on campus. 31% of those who self-identify as visible minority say they would live on campus if given the chance, compared to 15% of students who do not identify as a visible minority. Looking at how students get to and from their university, is two common ways. They're either using public transit or using a vehicle. That accounts for more than 7 in 10 students. Students who identify as visible minority are more likely to say they use public transportation. 48% of those who identify as visible minority say they take public transit, and they're less likely to use a vehicle. Also not surprising, older middle year students are more likely to say they use a vehicle and less likely to say they use public transportation. Looking at the academic profile of middle years students who completed the survey, so about 86% of students are attending full-time, and the older a student is, the less likely they are to say they are studying full-time. About 1 in 5 students have transferred from another university, and 87% claim to have a grade average of a B- or higher, of which 39% of those are A- or higher students. looking at students' weekly studying patterns. So this is their self-reported weekly studying patterns. And we asked them to break it down in terms of hours they spend in class versus hours they spend out of class. And so that's the number of hours on the left-hand side. Looking at hours they spend in class, you can see, sort of around 15-ish hours is where you get the majority of students, 15 or less, in terms of in-class hours. And they're spending, not, well, you get sort of a divergent. You get a fair number of students who are spending 10 or fewer hours. And then as you can see, as you creep up to that 20 or more, you can see a shift. So you have those students who are spending either, a lot more time outside of class than in class. When you look at the breakdown in total, students are spending, give or take almost the equivalent of a full-time job, about 30-ish hours combined in and out of class, with that outside of class making up on average slightly more of their hours than in class. There is a correlation here between hours spent and university grades. The lower a student's reported grade, the less time they spend on their academics outside of class. A student with a reported A- or higher average claims to spend about 18.5 hours a week outside of class, compared to those with a C+ or lower spend about 14 hours per week outside of class. Another interesting component of study patterns is the older a student is, the less time they spend in class, because they're more likely to be studying part-time. But there's no difference between how much time they're spending outside of class, indicating that older students on a ratio are spending a higher ratio of in-class to out-of-class time than younger students. So looking at the activities that students participate in on campus. So these are activities that they report doing often or very often. A lot of this, this is the 2023 survey, but still a lot of this still coming out of the pandemic, and a lot of these numbers are down relative to 2020. So you see at the most, student clubs and on-campus rec in terms of students who are saying they're doing often or very often. In terms of volunteering, 31% say they volunteer on or off campus, often or very often. This is down from 42% in 2020. Those who do volunteer about 3 to 3.5 hours a week. Now looking at students' current employment. So this is employment they have in their current academic year, so excluding summer employment. So 58%, so just over half students say that, yes, I am currently employed, I have a job. And amongst those who are employed, they work about 18 hours per week. So if you think about the typical or average student, if they're spending about 30-ish hours in and out of class in their academics, plus another 18 hours on average, a student who's working potentially spending 50 hours between their academic work and their employment work. We asked students about the impact that work has on their academics, whether that work has a positive impact, no impact, or a negative impact. So 16% of students say that has a positive impact. This is always a question that always surprises me. I'm assuming the positive impact are those who are doing work related to their studies, and the positive impact, I'm assuming, would be those that are actually helping them in some way, or perhaps it's a job where they're able to study while working it. 39% say it has no impact, but the largest group are 46% who say it has a negative impact. Some interesting comparisons here. Female students are more likely to be currently employed than male students. 63% of female students say they're currently employed compared to 46% of male students. There's also a difference here by age. The older a student is, the more hours they work per week. That is also coupled with the fact that older students are more likely to be going part-time. There's also some relationship here with grades. Those with lower grades are more likely to say that the work they do has a negative impact on their academic performance. Those who have a C+ or lower average, 59% say it has a negative impact on their academics, compared to just 38% with an A- or higher average. Now we start to look at students' educational experiences. So what are they doing, learning, and experience while they are taking their courses? So we asked students to rate aspects of their professors. And so we asked them first to say, well, how good of a job are professors doing in a number of areas? In terms of the top 5 areas that professors are performing best at, according to students, seeming knowledgeable in their field, treating students the same regardless of their gender, regardless of their race, being accessible out of class, and encouraging class discussions are where professors get rated the highest. What we follow up with is asking students in terms of, well, what is most important in terms of performance for professors? Of interest, when we look at the top 5 areas that are most important, there's not a lot of correlation between what's important and where there's the highest levels of performance. The only relationship in the top 5 is those who seem knowledgeable in their field finishes 5th in terms of being most important. The other 4 areas in terms of where they rank in terms of performance, communicating well is 6th, well organized is 7th, being intellectually stimulating and providing useful feedback rank towards the bottom of the areas of performance. We ask students if their ability to evaluate teaching, so are they able to evaluate the teaching in their courses? I think a lot of students sometimes confuse the ability to do it and whether or not they actually did it as 2 things, is what it is. So in terms of their ability to evaluate courses, there are 3% of students who say, I have never been able to evaluate any of the courses this term. There's another 11, 21% who say some or most of their courses, and the majority at 65% say they're able to evaluate all of the courses that they have taken. In terms of the satisfaction with the quality of teaching, we ask students how much they agree, disagree, they're satisfied with the quality of teaching. At the bottom, you've got about just less than 1 in 5 students that disagree that they're satisfied, and the majority who either agree or strongly agree, although the portion who strongly agree is not nearly as high as those who just simply agreed. So if you were to turn this into satisfaction, you might say, the majority tend to be satisfied as opposed to very satisfied. There is some relationship here with students' reported grades. As students' grades are lower, they are less likely to strongly agree that they're satisfied with the quality of teaching. So because my grades are lower, therefore the teaching is not as good. We ask a couple of questions about the perceptions of staff. 2 questions. Most agree that teaching assistants are helpful. 78% say teaching assistants are helpful. Another 88% say that support staff are helpful. We shift now focus to students' growth and development. So what areas have they been able to grow or develop within their studies? So we look at the top 5 skills in terms of the percentage that say that they have been able to grow or develop in these much or very much. So the top 5, there's sort of 2, 3-ish that stand out: working independently, ability to find and use information, and thinking logically and analytically. All 3 of those have more than 60% who say they've grown in those areas much or very much by their middle years. In terms of the bottom 5, and these are out of 30 different skills that are rated in terms of the bottom 5, appreciation of the arts and mathematical skills around 31%, and then 3 others, entrepreneurial, spiritual, and 2nd or 3rd language skills rank towards the bottom. Students who identify as a visible minority are more likely to say that they have grown in terms of developing 2nd or 3rd language skills, 23% compared to 11% who are not visible minority. And there's also a difference here between men and women. 42% of men say they've grown much or very much in mathematical skills compared to 26% of women. So what is students' level of commitment to completing their degree? This is the middle years, and so they're either in the 2nd or 3rd year. Well, their 2nd or 3rd year of studies doesn't mean they're not there for their 2nd through 8th year, but they're in the middle part of their program and are not graduating this year, and it's not their 1st year, so they're somewhere in between. So 82% agree or strongly agree that most of their courses are interesting. Another 83% say that they're in the right program for me, which is fairly good given that they're now in the middle years of their program. 77% say their course load is manageable, and a little bit lower relative to these other areas is that 65% said they had adequate info about their program prior to enrolling. In terms of their areas of effort, 93% say they're willing to put in a lot of effort to be successful. Another 73% say they can deal with stress. And 87% say they normally go to all of my classes, though I would love to understand what students mean when they say normally. It's not they normally go to all. It normally seems like a strange way with all, but they normally go to all. And 68% have good study habits. There is a difference here in terms of the strongly agree for the question about dealing with stress. Men at 26% say that they strongly agree that they can deal with stress, compared to 15% of women who say or strongly agree that they can deal with stress. There's also a couple differences here by students' reported grades. Students with an A- or higher average are more likely to agree that they have good study habits and can deal with stress than those with lower grades. So what does this mean in terms of their plans to come back for future years at their university? So 88% plan to come back to their university the next year. So about 12% say, I am not coming back. And 91 plan to complete their degree at the university. So it's a very, very small proportion who believe they're not going to come back and return. So about 3% there between those two. In terms of where students plan to be going, 13% plan to go to college next year, and 7% plan to transfer to another university the following year. So finances has a big it's a big component in terms of, for a lot of students, in terms of their ability to complete their program. So 69% agree or strongly agree that they have the finances and resources to be able to complete their program. When you look at this, their levels of agreement by two components: how much debt students say they currently have, debt related to their post-secondary education, and the funds they need to finance their current year, you start to see a relationship develop here. So when you look at the funds that students say they need to complete their current year of study, you don't see much difference in the average amount between those who strongly agree or disagree in terms of their having enough finances. What you do see is how debt plays into this, and you can see the debt level rise very sharply from the strongly agree up to the strongly disagree. Those who are more likely to disagree that they have the finances, the financial resources to complete the program, report substantially higher levels of debt. So it is not so much about how much is needed for their year of studies. It is really how they are financing that, and the debt they are taking on in terms of that seems to be the stick that drives them in terms of their agree or disagree with this statement. You also ask them, is university worth the cost? At the end of the day, 51% agree that university degree is worth the cost. This is always an interesting question to look at as students are sort of in the middle of their program. A lot of research indicates that as students exit university, this percentage tends to grow the further away they get from their degree. It is often hard for them to assess it, sort of in the current state. Again, when we look at the relationship between how much they agree or disagree that university is worth the cost in terms of funds and average debt, you don't see a huge difference here between the amount they need to finance their current year. You do again start to see some relationship between the debt they're taking on, not nearly as stark in contrast to the previous slide, but you do see the higher levels of disagreement do have higher debt levels, not nearly the same degree in terms of their ability to continue or have finances to complete, but you do see that relationship. So it's not so much about, again, the agreement that university is worth the cost. Debt levels and how they're financing seems to play a role in that. We ask students if their university, how their experiences are meeting their expectations. And so we look at it in three ways: whether their expectations were met, whether they were exceeded, or whether or not they have fallen short of their expectations. And so the largest group are those who say that they have met their expectations. Another 15% say their expectations were exceeded, and that is slightly lower than those who say that the expectations they had, their university experiences, have fallen short. There is some relationship here by grades. Results show that those with higher average university grades are more likely to say that their university exceeded their expectations relative to those with lower grades. For those with an A- or higher, 20% say their university has exceeded their expectations. For those who are C+ or lower, only 7% say university has exceeded their expectations. So looking at some overall evaluations of their university experience, so satisfaction with the university on two components: satisfaction with their decision to attend, and satisfaction with the concern that the university has shown for them as an individual. So in terms of concern as an individual, slightly more are set, not slightly more, about 2 to 1 in terms of satisfied to dissatisfied, although you can see a small proportion are very satisfied with the concern shown for them as an individual. There is higher rates of satisfaction with their decision to attend the university. More than 8 in 10 are satisfied or very satisfied in this area. So now we look at the question using the Net Promoter Score questions. To those unfamiliar with what the Net Promoter Score is, it asks those if they would recommend their university to others, and it's a common question to assess often in the marketing world, allegiance to or commitment to a brand. And so this is asked on an 11-point scale, which for researchers in us, 11-point, we go, why 11? And I go, well, it works. It's not something they promote or teach, but the 11-point scale for this actually works very well in terms of grouping and correlations or assessment to commitment. So that 11-point scale is grouped into 3 categories based on how people respond. And so they're grouped into what are called promoters, passives, and detractors. So promoters are those who give a rating of 9 or 10. And those are supposed to be those who would go out and actively be talking positively about your brand. They would be promoters. They'd be people who would be speaking about it. Passives are those rated a 7 or 10. And those are those who are just simply sort of neutral to the organization. They're not going to actively positively talk about it. They're not going to actively negatively talk about it. And then your detractors are those who are 6 or lower. And so the score is calculated by taking the promoters and subtracting the number of detractors. So in the 2023 middle year survey, 22% of students are considered promoters, giving a rating of 9 or 10. 44% are considered passive, giving a rating of 7 or 8. And 35% are detractors, giving a rating of 6 or lower. That leaves us with a Net Promoter Score of -13. A negative number is never a good thing. We do see some differences here. The middle years, and again, middle years, the universities participating does change from year to year, but in 2020, the middle years Net Promoter Score was a -1. So a -13 is down somewhat considerably from 3 years ago. We do also find some differences here between size of university. So smaller universities in terms of their student population and the programming do tend to have a slightly higher Net Promoter Score. Those smaller institutions have a Net Promoter Score of -7 relative to those that are slightly larger. Those have a Net Promoter Score of -17. Now looking at students' goal development. So what are their sort of goals and plans for after their university careers? And they're in middle years, so they're starting to understand those goals. So 91% say they've chosen their major, which is great now that they're in the middle years of their program. In terms of their career options, 32% say they have a specific career in mind, with another 35% who say they have several, but only 20% say they know their career options very well. Another 27% expect to apply to professional program, and 34% expect to apply to graduate school. In terms of steps that they have taken for employment, we have asked a number of steps. Overall, 94% of students have taken at least some step towards employment, although most of the steps towards the top, talking with parents, talking with friends, talking to professors, are not what you'd call concrete steps. Those more concrete, creating a resume or e-portfolio, working in your field, volunteering in your field, tend to be a bit lower. Looking at facilities and services in terms of how students use those facilities and services on campus. So the survey asks about 26 different facilities and services that students use. So in terms of use, there are a few that stand out amongst those 26. At the top is students' use of library e-resources. 51% say they use library e-resources in the past year. And that's followed by a number of other services: online bookstores, academic advising, on-campus bookstores, and food services. Few differences here. Women at 55% are more likely than men at 39% to say they've used the online university bookstore. The younger a student is, they are more likely to use aspects such as university residences and athletic facilities. And those who identify as visible minority are less likely to use a number of services, including online bookstores, physical bookstores, and parking. And parking is related to the fact, as I mentioned earlier, that those who identify as minority say they are more likely to take public transit. So also in terms of, in addition to use, we ask students how satisfied they are with these services. Typically, satisfaction is very, very high with most receiving satisfaction rates of 80% or higher, with a few exceptions. So you have a couple that are just below 80%. So 79% are satisfied with the employment services, 78% are satisfied with university residences. You got a couple slightly below that. Financial aid and food services are just slightly below at 76 to 74. If your university, or if you have been following CUSC trends over time, food services has slowly crept up over time in terms of satisfaction. If you go back 10, 15 years, aggregate level satisfaction was much more in the 50% range, and this has slowly come up over time, as I believe a lot of universities have enhanced or improved the food services available on campus. The one area that students are never satisfied with historically, and will probably never change, is 42% are satisfied with parking on campus. And that has been in the low 40s or high 30s almost historically year after year. So we've talked a little bit about finances in terms of its impact or relationship to their commitment. So looking at various components of financing, in terms of credit cards, 83% of students say they have at least one credit card. This is always an area where number of students always have questions about why they're asked about credit cards, and it's always been a way of tracking to see what alternate forms of debt students are taking on, which has become even more, at least in the public world, a little more important relative to debt levels and interest rates. Amongst those with the credit cards, 79% say they do not carry a monthly balance. So that means there's 21% who at least carry some balance on their credit card month after month. And for those who are carrying a balance, they average about $3,700 in debt on their credit cards. There's some relationship here with age. The older middle year student is, the more likely they are to have a credit card and multiple credit cards, and they are less likely to pay off their balance each month. Also, you look at the average debt level by age, just overall, not just those with debt, it increases from $279 in debt for those 19 and younger up to almost $2,200 for those 22 and older. So we ask about their debt levels. 37% say they have acquired some debt related to their education, most often debt from government loans, but also loans from family, loans from banks, and other sources. Older students are more likely to just have debt in general. Only 28% of students 19 and younger report having education-related debt, compared to 50% of students 22 and older. In terms of their debt amounts, the average amongst those with debt is around $21,000 for those with debt. There is some relationship here. Again, those who are more likely to have it, the vast majority often comes from government loans, loans from family, loans from banks account for a little bit more, and other sources. The older a student is, not only are they more likely to have debt, but the average debt increases as well. When we ask them how they finance, so the amount required to finance a single year or their current year of university, students say it takes about $17,000 or just over $17,000 to fund their current year. Now, that funding and financing, for a lot of students, they're taking into account more than simply just the cost of books and their university costs. They're often factoring in things like cost of gas, parking, transit, all these other components that go into it. In terms of where they finance from, those common sources, parents and family are at the top list. 56% say they get money from parents and family. And then they're followed by summer work, scholarships, and government loans. The interesting part is there is not necessarily a direct correlation with the percentage of students who are using each source and the amount. There's three that stand out in terms of the amount that they use to finance. So parents and family, current work, and government loan each account for just over $8,000 a year, whereas summer work and scholarships, which are used fairly commonly, summer work counts for just under $6,000 and scholarships only count for about $3,000. So there isn't always a direct relationship between the percentage of students and how much that accounts for. There is some relationship here with a number of factors. So those who identify as a member of a visible minority are less likely than those who do not identify to rely on earnings from summer work and from RSPs. Those with higher grades are more likely to say they fund their university this year through university scholarships. And the older a student is, the more likely they are to be financing their education through government loans, but less likely through parents or family, less likely through earnings from summer work, scholarships, or awards. So each year, CUSC has been adding for the past years, a module that is unique to this year and this survey. For the 2023 survey, CUSC added a module of questions about gender identification, sexual orientation, and acceptance in a variety of situations on campus. And this module is optional for universities to opt into. So the results from the upcoming slides are only for those institutions that had opted into the module, the EDI A module for this year. So the first thing we'll look at is students' gender identities. This is their self-identified gender identity. So about 90% identify as a woman or man. And then you have other categories accounting for anywhere from 3% to just under 1%. In terms of their sexual orientation, 64% identified as heterosexual. You have three categories that account for a little bit more in terms of bisexual, asexual, or queer. And then other categories or other groups accounting for 3 to less than 1%. It is important to know that in both the gender identity and sexual orientation questions, that students were able to select multiple responses, so they can identify as more than one. So if you are eagerly adding these percentages up with the calculator, you'll notice that they often add to more than 100%. So this question asked about inclusivity in terms of how whether students quite a bit or very much feel like they're included in various components on campus. At the high end, 85% feel like they're included when interacting with friends on campus, and that's followed somewhat by attending classes. They feel a little less included in terms of interacting with instructors or professors, participating in class activities, and interacting with university staff. Also a little bit lower is interacting with students they don't know well, participating in extracurricular activities, attending campus social events, and actively participating in campus social events. Now, these modules just look at these questions at the aggregate level. This presentation hasn't looked at we haven't looked at any differences between groups based on their self-identified gender identity or their self-identified sexual orientation. These are all at the aggregate level. So another component that is done each year is CUSC performs an experiment to assess a number of different factors, often related to response validity or response rates. And so in 2023, the experiment done was to determine if the length of survey or how the length of survey impacts survey completion. So the CUSC survey in 2021, or 2023, excuse me, is 191 questions, and it takes approximately about 20 minutes on average for students to complete. And so CUSC wanted to test whether the length of the survey or shortening the survey would improve completion rates. So universities that opted into the experiment had the option, they would assign 10% of the sample equally, so 5%, 5%, to two shortened versions of the survey, either survey A or survey B. So students were randomly assigned, or 10% of that sample was assigned to those. 120 questions or 101 questions to determine if a shorter length would impact response rates or completion rates. So 8 universities out of the 29 opted into the experiment. So the way the experiment worked is in the email contact that students received, they were told whether the survey would take 15 minutes if they were assigned to group A or group B. If they were assigned to the non-experimental group, which is the standard CUSC survey, they were told in the email that it would be 20 minutes. So first thing we want to look at is what was the impact of the time to complete the survey? Did it actually work? Did shortening the survey actually do what it's supposed to do first and foremost? So in terms of those that participated in the experiment, so those 8 universities, you can see that the shortened version did do what it is supposed to do. It is shorter. On average, it's about 8 minutes shorter, or the median, it's about 6 to 7 minutes shorter. So it is much shorter than the full version. So it did have the intended impact in terms of actually being shorter, which was easy to do. You take questions away, it typically will be shorter, but wanted to make sure that those align. So the average is always going to skew up a little bit, which is why I think the median is a better indicator of the time it actually takes students to complete. So at 13 minutes, it was in or around or slightly less than the 15 minutes that students were told. Now, what did it do to completion rates? So the hypothesis is that a shortened survey should increase completion rates. And that is really not the case. So in terms of completion rates in the non-experimental group, so those that were assigned to the full CUSC survey of 191 questions, the response rate amongst those 8 institutions was around 27%. The experimental group A was 30% and experimental group was 26%. And there's, just because of sample size, you're going to see some differences between A and B in the non-experimental group. But generally speaking, those completion rates in terms of A are slightly higher, but in terms of B are also slightly lower. And so you don't really see a drastic increase in response rates. So when you think about a standard sample, so if you think of group A, so let's say hypothetically speaking, this 3.2 percentage point increase is real in terms of what that would do in a group of 1,000 students, which is about a typical standard survey. It's going to yield 32 additional responses by having this shortened survey, but it's going to yield 37% less information. So we wanted to look at survey rates by university, so those 8 participating universities, to say maybe there was something that impacted this that was just, at a university level, something really, crazy was going on that impacted something. And you can see between most universities, especially those with a larger sample, this one here with 300, you have to think about the fact that only 30 students were assigned to the experimental condition or 15 to group A and group B. So these percentages here you have to take with a very big grain of salt. But generally speaking, you can see that the experimental conditions don't really yield any drastic difference on a university by university basis. The only university that consistently had a higher response rate between group A and group B was this first university, which we're calling University 1. They had a 48 and 49% response rate compared to 41%. But generally speaking, the response rates for the short and the regular version were very much the same. So theoretically, in order to complete the survey, or in order for that shortened survey to have an impact, it's not just coupled with do students complete the survey, but also do they actually click the link to do the survey? Because theoretically, the shortened survey, saying the survey is 50 minutes, should be less of a barrier or less of a deterrent than saying it's a 20-minute survey. And so in order to have higher completion rates, part of it is coupled in the fact that you should have more students clicking to start or do the survey because you have removed a bit of a barrier by having a shorter survey. So looking at students who just clicked the link, because we can track whether or not they've actually clicked the link within their survey, you can see there is almost no difference between those 3 groups and the percentage of students that actually clicked the survey to start the survey. So in order to have a higher completion rate, it's coupled with not only you should have more students going in to start it because it should be less of a barrier, but also a shorter survey should also drive them through because it's less questions to answer to get to the end. And neither of those seems to be the case. And so the shortened survey didn't really generate any greater number of clicks on the link. So what does this tell us in general about this experiment? It tells us a couple of things. First is the shortened version, it had the desired effect of reducing the average time to completion. So it really did the thing it's supposed to have done. At the very least, the experiment worked in terms of the manipulation, but there were no practical gains in terms of the proportion of students who completed the survey. And this really seems to be driven by the fact that just telling students the survey is shorter doesn't really cause them to click or start the survey in any greater numbers. And so has been the case in a number of past experiments with CUSC. The driving factors in terms of response rates really are driven by 2 factors. Intrinsic motivators. So there are students who are going to do the survey, whether the survey is 2 minutes or 50 minutes, they're just going to do the survey. The difference between a 15 and 20-minute survey in terms of what students are told, perhaps there really isn't that much difference in terms of a cognitive barrier in terms of 15 minutes and 20 minutes to a student may sound exactly the same. And remember, they don't know that other students are getting a 20-minute survey, so they're unaware that there is a savings in time to them. The other main factor that drives response rates are external motivators. So that is an incentive to complete the survey. So there are students who are driven by the fact that they are given something, whether that is a direct incentive, like I've seen universities give out, everyone gets $2 or $5. I've seen draws. The big thing that we have noticed both with CUSC experimentation and other experimentations we do with our research is a single larger incentive always works better than smaller multiple incentives. I believe there's a couple reasons. One is most gambling literature will show that large prizes are a bigger incentive. I always use lottery tickets. People can't be bothered to buy a lottery ticket for $1 million because who cares? But when it's $10 million, people are $50 million. They're driving to the store like crazy to buy their lottery tickets, right? Even though they're both a substantial amount of money. Same thing with students. They're driven by the fact that there's a larger fish being dangled at the end, or a larger carrot being dangled at the end of the stick. The other thing too is also just in terms of students' ability, or any person's ability to read and remember. So the number $500, students aren't reading, or people aren't necessarily reading to say, well, is it 1 prize or 10 prizes? They just see a number very often. And so if you have 100 prizes of $10, which increases their ability to get that money, what often is the driver is that $10. And people and students just see the dollar amount, the number, and that is what drives them. They don't think about odds. They don't think about relationships. They don't know how many students are completing the survey, their odds of winning. So therefore, a larger incentive just typically tends to increase response rates than smaller incentives. And any incentive works better than none. Offering students $10 will increase response rates than offering them nothing. So that is the presentation in a nutshell. To have a little closing remarks before we see if there's any additional questions. Just want to mention that in terms of the CUSC survey for 2024 is focused on graduating students. So we just finished the middle years. So the following year, so in 2024, we'll be focused on the survey of graduating students. Registration for the 2024 survey will open in early, or that should say December 2023, not 2024, because that would be after the survey is already done. It's going to focus on such items as satisfaction with professors, perceptions of growth and development, very similar to what we had here, finances and debt. In terms of what it looks at specifically for graduating students, employment plans, and then evaluation of overall education experiences. A recording of this presentation will be on CUSC's YouTube channel in September. So if you would like to rewatch this, share it with your coworkers and friends, you can feel free to do that. And the AGM for CUSC will be on November 7th, 2023 at noon Eastern. So please mark your calendars for that AGM. And also, CUSC will be exhibiting at the 2023 SERPA conference in Winnipeg. And since I'm in Winnipeg and the hotel is literally 2 blocks, as I point down my window down there, I encourage everyone to come to the SERPA conference in October and share everything Winnipeg has, including construction from Road A to Road B, because that is all that's around here at the moment. But I strongly encourage people to attend the SERPA conference. It's always a very good conference, and a chance to talk to CUSC members, CUSC board members. I will be there, and other members of our staff will be at the conference as well, and always love to talk about the CUSC survey. So from there, we are done. I'll pass it back to Glenn to see if there's any additional questions or comments.
Okay, I'll just go on a little bit about SERPA. CUSC is going to be hosting a panel discussion on survey response rates at that conference. So taking some of what we've learned and hopefully learning things from others who have expertise in the area. So that will be fun to do. All right, there were 2 questions and they both related to employment. The first is whether the employment figures was all students or just part-time or full-time students. And I think the answer to that is all students.
All students is correct, yeah. So the 58% who are currently employed in their year is all students, yes.
Right. The second question is whether we have information on the difference between domestic and international students for employment. I thought that might be a more challenging question.
So do we have it? Not on the tips of my fingers, So no, can I speak to it at this exact moment? No. I will say though, because there is such a high relationship between students who identify as those minority international students, there probably is, we know that employment is lower amongst those students, but we didn't specifically look at international or non-international students in the analysis. But for those who are CUSC participants, they have their data file. But if it's something that others would be interested in who aren't, you send an email to the CUSC board, and we can potentially provide some analysis in that area.
Right. There's a request to go back to the first slide on finance.
Finance. I can certainly share the screen, and I can certainly try. Well, there are many slides on finance, so I'm going to assume it is this one, because the first slide is credit cards, so I feel like it's debt, unless we're talking about specifically about finance, which would be this one.
This is Christian from University of St. Boniface in Winnipeg. It's because it's the chart that shows comparing debt and fees.
Yes. Okay. So we want to look at this.
Yes, those are the ones. Okay. So I guess it's because I'm trying to wrap my brain around this chart. So I'm trying to, because let's say we look at the strongly agree. We're looking at, $22,000 worth of expense. And then in the strongly disagree, we're looking at over $30,000 worth of expense. So I'm not sure how to understand the total the total expenditure here.
No, so this is two separate questions. So you don't add these two together. What the yellow bars are saying is this is how much they said it took them to pay for their current year. The red bar is how much debt they currently have. And so what this is saying is that if the debt levels potentially could be driven by the fact that these students are paying more, which they're not, right? Those who strongly disagree, it costs them about $18,000 to fund a current year. That's almost the same amount to those who strongly disagree. So what it's showing is that the bigger impact on confidence to have the financing isn't about how much it costs them for a year. It's really much more about how they're financing it.
Okay, so it's a current debt, not current debt applied to the current year of study.
Correct. Yes.
Okay,
so
very good.
This current debt could be anywhere from, depending on what middle year they're in, anywhere from their second or third year. But yeah, so this slide is really meant to say that the driver of this financing isn't so much about how much it costs, right? So, not that universities have a lot of control over it, but lowering your tuition, theoretically, it's not the cost, it's how students finance it more that really drives this ability to say, I'm going to have the money. It's much more about the debt.
Thank you.
Right. And to stay in the area of finances, there's a question about university being worth the cost. And the question is really longitudinal. Over time, are we seeing a change in that percentage? You say that a university degree is worth the cost. And the one possibility is that we're seeing that number decline over time, and therefore our product is in trouble because people don't think it's worth the cost.
Okay, so it is a hard, like I could very quickly, I get 2 seconds. I could find what it was in 2020. I very quickly find it. So it's just a comparison to 3 years ago. Like longitudinally, you'd have to go back. The always issue with the longitudinal comparison is that universities change. Okay, so just in 2020 was 58%. This year it's 51%. So 3 years ago was 58%. So it was a drop. I can't remember longitudinally what it is over time, but again, part of the issue is that institutions change. And so if you wanted to do a very proper longitudinal comparison, you would want to select only those institutions that have done it year over year. As I did see this did strike me as a lower number than I have seen in the past, and it is definitely lower than the 58% 3 years ago.
Right. So there is some possibility of fruitful analysis of that. This is my opportunity to pitch participating in CUSC and participating as a member of the CUSC consortium, because members get not only your own institutional data, but you also get the national data set. And that enables you as a member, if you have those data sets over a series of years, to be able to compare your data longitudinally and also see the national data longitudinally. We also have a mechanism, and you'll find this on our website, for making data requests if you really do want to explore that more deeply.
Huh. And I actually just went back and looked at 2017. So it has actually dropped. In 2017, it was 65%, then dropped to 58, and now it's 51. So the question about, are we seeing a slide? It, on very quick face value, does seem like, yes, there is a slide.
That's right.
There you go.
All right. I don't see any further questions. And we're losing people, I assume, because everybody's time is tight. So at this point, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for this webinar. As Nicholas said, it will be posted on our YouTube channel. You don't have to go to YouTube to see that. You'll be able to see it on our website as well once we post it. So please do stay tuned to our website. That's CUSC-CCREU.ca. And we will have further information about next year's survey there as soon as it's available. So thank you for participating.